All right, big day in the NFL today as teams cut their rosters down to 53. I'm Chris Hassel, joined by Brady Quinn. We've had some big names already get shown the door. Several players from just this past season's draft in 2021, including a first-round pick last year, Alex Leatherwood, the offensive lineman for the Raiders, played at guard. They were hoping he could play tackle. Well, the Raiders say goodbye, and their woes from recent drafts continue. Also had a bunch of quarterbacks as well. Kellen Mond, Josh Rosen, and Ian Book get released today. It's not just Brady Quinn with us today. We're also joined by Jonathan Jones, our lead NFL insider, and Pete Prisco, our lead NFL mouth. Let's start with the Cowboys, who, listen, they released Cooper Rush and Will Grier, and now Dak's the only guy on the active roster. What happens if he gets hurt or loses his helmet and they don't have any timeouts?
They're going to add another quarterback or two, potentially in the practice squad as that third quarterback at some point. It's more of a formality right now as you're going through the roster to try to get the best 53 possible, and then you worry about the backup quarterback position. But, you know, look, I think in some organizations, when you've got a roster that's built to really compete for Super Bowls, you're going to look at that backup quarterback as more of your insurance policy and probably take it more seriously and be willing to show out a little bit more dough. I don't know if the Jones family doesn't realize if they are actually competing for a Super Bowl that this could be a likelihood given Dak Prescott's injury history, but clearly it's a need for them. I think my concern right now looking at it is whether it's Will Grier or Cooper Rush are either good enough to help this team win the division and actually help them anywhere after that, or are they just there basically as a stopgap to get them through a game and then get them on to the next game where hopefully you can find a veteran that can come in and start some games for you. Either way you spell it, doesn't look good for the Cowboys.
No, I mean, right now, in my estimation, this is just very surely something
I'm
that
with
they're
you,
doing
Brady.
to
I mean,
sneak some other.
I can't hear you.
Pete apologizes, JJ.
I'll
Go
take
ahead.
this one, Pete. So they're just trying to get 52 other guys on the roster at this point, and they're not going to go into Week 1 with just Dak Prescott. It very likely is going to be Cooper Rush, I would say, over a Will Grier. But the Cowboys know if something happens to Dak Prescott that their season is ultimately over with, or they're going to have to make a massive trade for a guy that would not be on their roster right now anyway. And so I just view this as a classic roster mechanic, and it was similar to last week. A lot of folks made a lot out of the Jaguars not having a kicker. Well, they weren't going into Week 1 without a kicker. They just that was just the day that they didn't have a kicker, and today is the day that the Cowboys only have one quarterback.
It is the backup quarterback. If you're playing your backup quarterback for more than 1 or 2 games, usually your team is dead anyways, and that will be the case for the Dallas Cowboys, whether it's Will Grier, Cooper Rush, or Brady Quinn comes out of retirement. It doesn't matter. If Dak Prescott isn't playing, your season is over.
Some would make the case, by the way, that maybe they're not even the favorite to win the division anyway, even with Dak Prescott as their quarterback. So,
would you be one of those people?
I wouldn't. I actually still think they're the favorite, and I think Washington's another team to keep an eye on.
Washington and the Eagles are up there in odds as well. I know a lot of people think that Jalen Hurts and the Eagles can win that division as well. New Orleans Saints also releasing a quarterback that was drafted just this past season. 2021 draft, Ian Book, 4th-round pick last year. Brady, I know you like the kid from Notre Dame, fellow Fighting Irish. What do you think of the Saints dumping him?
I think when you look at some of the moves that are made, especially when we'll get to Alex Leatherwood, and we'll talk to that in a second, or Kellen Mond, who we've mentioned, a lot of this has to do with not having an advocate there anymore. If you look at the regime who drafted Kellen Mond, for example, no longer there. Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer are no longer there, new regime. Sean Payton, who was the advocate who loved Ian Book, he's not there either as the head coach. So if you're not out there performing, and I think it really took until that preseason finale for Ian Book to play well, there's not any room for you, at least on the active roster. Now, I definitely think he's a candidate for the practice squad, and that's most likely what will end up happening. But as soon as you saw the Saints bring in Andy Dalton, he's a veteran with experience. He was going to be the backup. And then they also have Pete Prisco's favorite quarterback option in the NFL, Taysom Hill. And well, however you want to describe it. But the reality is I think they look at Ian Book probably more as a developmental project and most likely will be back on their practice squad.
Pete, do you think that means that the gimmick is once again going to be a quarterback?
I was there last week, and he was doing nothing but playing tight end. I mean, he didn't take any snaps at the quarterback position, but in a disaster, yes, he could take snaps at quarterback. I mean, as a gimmick, he can fill in that role, but ideally they like him to play tight end.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to get in trouble because I keep referring to him as a gimmick. I'm just saying that because that's what Pete calls him.
Well, but you're
really,
now you're calling him that
because
Pete never actually said that.
No, Pete always says it.
He's never said that before in his life.
Yes,
Pete, I'm going to defend you right now.
Only every show.
I've never heard Pete say it. Only you said it, and then Pete co-signed it.
Let's get JJ in here on the Vikings cutting Kellen Mond. JJ, they drafted him last year in the 3rd round, hoping that maybe he could be the quarterback of the future to replace Kirk Cousins. Why did that go so wrong so fast?
He had a pretty bad preseason. That's number one. He didn't really perform out there on the field. Now, you don't perform out there on the field, they say, okay, well, you're just a second-year guy, that's all right. Well, the issue is, as Brady alluded to just a moment ago, his advocate isn't there, the guy who drafted him, Rick Spielman. And that group, there was a lot of turnover, of course, in that front office, and namely at the general manager position with Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah. And this is a guy, Kwesi comes from a Wall Street background. He comes from an analytics background. He's a guy who I very much believe if he has identified something as a mistake, he's not going to keep that mistake as he has identified it going for any reason. And so he didn't draft him. He doesn't think that he's worthwhile. Obviously, they made the trade for Nick Mullins back a couple of weeks ago. They've cut Sean Mannion as well. They know that and are relying on Kirk Cousins this upcoming year. But, of the 4 picks that they had in the 2021 NFL draft, the Minnesota Vikings, they've cut 3. Today and this week, and only Christian Darrisaw remains, who I'm told had a very, very solid camp. So when you get the new sheriff in town, that's the way things go a lot of times.
Yeah, we have a lot of fodder for Rick Spielman's first year when he gets into that green room, I can tell you that. Rick Spielman's great, by the way. He gives me an endless stream of crap, so I'm going to give it right back to him. But as far as Kellen Mond, the guy was scatter shooting everything all over the place. I mean, that was his nickname, scatter shoot. There it is, hitting the dirt, throwing in the dirt. He was terrible. He was a bad quarterback. And last year, Mike Zimmer, they wanted to try and get him to play. Mike Zimmer would never play him because he thought he was awful. And he is. He's not a good quarterback. So he's gone. They bring in Nick Mullins. Nick Mullins came the day we were there for our day at camp, and it was obvious that Kellen Mond was going away.
The reality is, Kellen Mond just needed a little bit more development. Now, he played a lot at the college level. I don't know that he fully ever developed into the quarterback he potentially could be. And I'm not saying that he's going to eventually make his way in the NFL and become that guy, because he's probably not going to get that opportunity. But the reality is that's what happens a lot with these quarterbacks. It's a developmental sport, in particular that position. Some guys need more reps than others, and that's why you see some guys have a hard time being able to hang on. And we're going to talk about another one here in a moment.
And that would be Josh Rosen, who the Browns released today. This is a guy who was picked 10th overall 4 years ago. This is the 4th different team that's already moved on from him. JJ, is this the end of the road for Rosen? He's been given several opportunities ever since he was drafted by the Cardinals.
Yeah, you'd have to imagine that maybe a team is going to bring him onto their practice squad. You get 16 players. Every team wants a capable enough quarterback on the practice squad to at least give you decent scout team looks, right? So I can imagine that he could be signed to a practice squad at some point over the next week. But as far as is this the last that we've seen of Josh Rosen in a quarterback competition in training camp? Very possibly, very likely so. And you go back, and he was in a difficult situation, sort of an arranged marriage in Arizona when he got drafted. And his career has gone down ever since then. And it's unfortunate for him. Fit matters so much. Whether you were placed in the right situation early on matters so much. And then, of course, a lot is up to you. And it's between the years. And he was given an opportunity to go in and compete against Josh Dobbs there for the number 3 quarterback spot behind Jacoby Brissett, of course, and behind Deshaun Watson. And Dobbs, frankly, won that number 3 job. And so Josh Rosen, I think, can look around, and he was given plenty of opportunity in Cleveland, given a nice little runway to try to work his way to QB3, and he lost out on that one.
Well, the reality is he got there 4 weeks ago. I mean, Josh Dobbs at least was signed this offseason. I mean, that's the other thing is, I don't know that you found a quarterback that's had a worse go of it after being a first-round pick, being on a bad football team to start, then he gets released or traded at that point in time. So the Cardinals move on from him, and he's been trying to find traction ever since. I mean, the reality is it was an uphill battle to begin with. When he signed with the Cleveland Browns at that point, it was probably more of a sign of saying, hey, we need a guy to come in here, learn our system. He's going to get released, but then if we need him to at some point in time come back during the season, we can bring him back in. We feel confident that he'll be out there, he'll be available, and he can still provide some depth. There was never a quarterback competition here. The truth of the matter is when a guy gets there 3-4 weeks ahead of time, he doesn't know that scheme. He doesn't know the offense or have chemistry with the guys he's throwing to. So it was an uphill battle to begin with.
One of the players released today was a first-round pick just a little over a year ago, and that's one of those Raiders picks from the old regime, Alex Leatherwood, who was an offensive guard. They were trying to move him to right tackle this season. It wasn't quite working out. JJ, what happened with the Raiders and Leatherwood to cut bait with him before his second season?
Yeah, 17th overall pick, and you really never see it happen at that point. When you're in the middle of the first round, you're almost guaranteed a second year because of financials. The Raiders are going to be eating a lot of this money if he is not claimed off of waivers, which hard to imagine that he ultimately would be claimed off of waivers because you probably were just going to give up a conditional 7th round pick in order to trade for him and guarantee that you would get him. But still possible they get a little bit of relief. But this is Dave Ziegler, the new general manager, Josh McDaniels, the new head coach, coming in and looking at Alex Leatherwood, a guy who was not wanted, as I'm told, by a majority of the scouting staff with the Raiders. This was a classic John Gruden pick in collaboration with then offensive line coach Tom Cable. This was not a Mike Mayock pick. It's hard to say of those 6 right there, how many were 100% John Gruden and or 100% Mike Mayock and what was collaborative. But I can tell you, the guy at the top of that list, Alex Leatherwood, was a John Gruden selection through and through. And so his advocate was out of the building, as we've talked about before. And not only that, but he didn't play well. And yeah, he was flip-flopping at positions. He's a fantastic athlete, a highly decorated offensive lineman coming out of Alabama. But clearly the Raiders just were done with him.
Personnel man was awful. I mean, let's be real about it. He wasn't good at it when he was in Tampa, and they won a Super Bowl with guys that were there. He wasn't good at it with the Raiders. Cleveland Farrell is another one of his picks. I know that for a fact. The organization wanted Devin White. He wanted Cleveland Farrell. Disaster. Alex Leatherwood, same thing. The drafts have been terrible. It's not a good organization in terms of what they've done the last couple of years. They did get a guy this year that they really like in Thayer Munford, a guy I really liked. He's got a chance to be their long-term right tackle out of Ohio State. And so if you miss on a guy like Leatherwood, it really helps when you can bounce back and get a guy in the later rounds like Munford.
This is a classic example when we talk about regime change, but also coach and then scheme. A lot of times, in particular when you're drafting offensive linemen, you're looking for certain traits and skills to be able to work with. And clearly, Josh McDaniels, Dave Ziegler, they don't believe that Alex Leatherwood fits that profile of what they're looking for. And really, there's no need to move, hang on to him at this point. You might as well trade him, move on from now, or release him and move on and start anew with someone else. So, again, it's a tough day for a lot of players in the NFL and trying to find an understanding and trying to find traction to find a job out there. But the truth of the matter is the organization plays a big role, too, and a lot of that stuff is out of your hands. So, look, hopefully Alex Leatherwood can continue to improve and then find, his way onto a roster somewhere else where he fits that particular scheme and coaching style better.
The Chiefs released him today, Brady, and it's kind of sad because this is like the longest he's been in the league and active, 11 straight months with the Chiefs, but his game isn't there anymore.
No, it's not. I mean, and look, you just hope that everything off the field is put together and it's where it needs to be for him to transition, out of football. I don't know how many more teams are going to give him an opportunity at this point in time. The reality is, he's up there in age. I don't know that he's flashed the same ability that we saw almost a decade ago. So, at this point, it could be it. So you just really hope that whatever changes transpired over the course of his time with the Chiefs, those will be lasting for him as he transitions out of football or potentially to another league.
31 years old now, Josh Gordon, released by the Kansas City Chiefs, who have a new look wide receiver core with Juju Smith-Schuster, MVS, and rookie Sky Moore, who could be a fantasy sleeper as well. McCole Hardman, one of the lone holdovers there. Hey, Pete, O.J. Howard never lived up to the hype in Tampa. Bills took a chance on him. They released him today with Dawson Knox, Tommy Sweeney, and Quentin Morris. Why was O.J. Howard never able to fulfill the potential we thought he had? Let's move on to the conversation that really got going yesterday with Jimmy Garoppolo agreeing to a new restructured one-year deal to stay with San Francisco and stay as the backup to Trey Lance. He took less money, but it's money that's now guaranteed to him. He probably would have been cut today had he not agreed to this deal. And he has a no-trade clause now and a no-tag clause as well. He is going to be the highest paid backup quarterback in the league, but will have a lot more of a say into what happens after this season as the 49ers backup quarterback and potentially starting quarterback at some point this season. Let's discuss.
One of the highest paid, not the highest. Sam Darnold would be the highest if we're assuming he's going to be the backup.
If he doesn't get more of that money that it could be in the contract.
Could be. As
Up
of
to
right
16.
now, he's not, but
Okay.
it could be. The interesting thing about this is everyone sees that no trade clause and they think, oh, he's not going to get traded. Not technically true. It just allows him the opportunity to refuse if there's a trade request to a team that he doesn't want to go to. That's what those clauses state. And so there's still the potential of that as we see kind of this carousel of moving parts with teams trying to construct a 53-man roster. Now, I don't think the 49ers would agree to this deal with Jimmy Garoppolo unless they thought he's going to be needed, and there is some potential doubt about Trey Lance, at least for this year. And I think anyone who watched him last year would see the upside, but also how green he was, and there's still some development there. And you're basically letting a guy go that got you to a Super Bowl and an NFC Championship game, which regardless of what people want to say about Jimmy G, he's still a very capable quarterback, and you're on a roster that is loaded and a chance to go make a run. And so why not try to keep him around if you can for an economical amount? So I love this deal for Jimmy G. I like this deal for the 49ers in the sense of what it brings. The question now just becomes how Trey Lance performs. And if this is going to put more pressure on him, because the guy who's already had success there with the 49ers is sitting in that room watching him and waiting for that next opportunity.
JJ?
It does come down to Trey Lance, and this is why it could be a win-win. This could be why it's a win-lose, and this is why it could be a lose-lose situation. It can be win-win because Trey Lance can go out there, play so much better than he had in the preseason. Make no mistake about it, he struggled in the preseason and in training camp. He had his ups and downs, like a second-year quarterback who didn't play much last year, who didn't play much in college at a lower level, you would probably expect. But if he plays well, and Jimmy Garoppolo never has to see the field, and then a quarterback has an unfortunate injury on one of the 31 other teams, and Jimmy Garoppolo wants to go to that team, and that team wants Jimmy Garoppolo, then the Niners can trade him for a whole lot more than they would have traded him, certainly today, because they wouldn't have traded him. No one wanted his previous contract. It could be a win-lose because if Trey Lance is bad, and you ultimately have to break glass in case of emergency and bring out Jimmy Garoppolo, and Garoppolo is good for you this year, well, yeah, you're probably winning this year, but you have a real issue down the road on what you're going to do at the future of your franchise quarterback. And then finally, if Lance is bad and then Garoppolo comes in and he's bad or he gets injured and you have lost your investment there and you don't know where you're going to turn in year 3 for Trey Lance at this point next year, then that can be a lose-lose. So ultimately, all of this is up to Trey Lance.
This is a hedge. This is an organization that made the move to go get Trey Lance. They were bullish on the move. They made the decision. And after watching him this summer and throughout preseason, they have doubts. They will never admit that, but they have doubts. This is the only reason you do this. You bring, because this creates nothing but a guy looking over his shoulder. It creates problems in the locker room if Lance doesn't play well. And by the way, talking to people at Minnesota when they practiced up there last week, 2 weeks ago, he wasn't very good. A lot of people weren't that impressed with him. And so I think there's great concern as to whether this team, which is built to win now, is ready to compete for a Super Bowl with Trey Lance.
Philadelphia Eagles hope they can compete in the NFC East and get back to the postseason like they did last year. And there were some saying that there was one glaring hole on this roster, and it was at the safety position. They tried to address that today. They traded for Saints defensive back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, who has played cornerback, has played safety. JJ, how did this get done?
Well, yeah, I mean, to your point, the Eagles aren't foolish. They know that this is a safety position that they have struggled to fill for the last couple of years. And so Howie Roseman makes the move, and we heard from Dennis Allen earlier today, who didn't really want to go too much into details, but things had soured between Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and the New Orleans Saints. And so now, as it became clear that an extension would not be reached there with the Saints, they deal him to the Philadelphia Eagles, making a relative weakness, certainly a strength. They're going to be able to do a lot in Jonathan Gannon's defense with a physical sort of defensive back, a guy that you can move around in a couple of places, give you a little position flexibility and versatility, and really shoring up whatever weaknesses that they have. So, the fact is, when you look at this, should they have ever drafted, and I've tweeted this earlier today, should they have ever drafted J.J. Arcega-Whiteside in the second round of the 2019 draft? No. They obviously should have drafted DK Metcalf if they needed a wide receiver, and we probably were all screaming at the television at that point or talking on here about it. But 3 years later, they had J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. They flipped him for the defensive back from the Seattle Seahawks, and then they flipped him again and got a 7th-round pick. Ultimately, what they were able to get here was Chauncey Gardner-Johnson for J.J. Arcega-Whiteside and a future 5th. That's ultimately what it nets out to today. So that's pretty good by Howie Roseman, all things considered. He has been an aggressive GM, one of the most aggressive GMs in the entire NFL. I really, really love this move.
So the Eagles bolstering the secondary. Pete, go ahead.
I love this move as well, and the reason being, this guy can do so many different things. I mean, and he's a pain in the ass on the field. The opposition hates this guy, and that's going to be good for the Eagles' defense. I mean, he really pushes the envelope. He wanted more money in New Orleans. He couldn't get it done, and they felt that, hey, why not get something for him before he leaves next year? They like some of their young defensive backs, but JJ's right. This Eagles defense, adding this guy to the defense, they've added people at every level. They're much better, and it's all on Jalen Hurts. Look, if Jalen Hurts takes the next step, they win the division. If he doesn't, then they're going to be looking for a new quarterback, but they do have 2 first-round picks next year.
It is 4 o'clock in the East. That is the deadline for teams to cut their rosters to 53 for the upcoming season. Chris Hassel joined by Brady Quinn, Pete Prisco, and Jonathan Jones. JJ, quickly tell us why we might still find out that more players are cut over the next several hours, maybe even day or so.
Yeah, a lot of roster mechanics right now that you want to carry a guy on your team right now so that you can stash him on the reserve physically unable to perform list or the short-term IR. So he'll be out for the first 4 or 6 games of the year, for example, but you didn't want to place him on IR now because then he wouldn't be available to you throughout the season. So a guy could have made the roster right now, and it's really just a placeholder for another roster mechanism that could take place after tomorrow. Listen, all these teams that just went from 75 or 80 players to down to 53, there's a lot of quality talent that's out there that's going to hit the waiver wire or who won't be subject to waivers whatsoever. And teams are going to look at those players and say, all right, we're going to lay claim to that player on the waiver wire, and that will be done by noon Eastern on Wednesday. Or we're going to try to sign this free agent who is available. And when that's the case, let's say you bring in 2 guys, well, if you're at 53 now, you need to get down to 51 to bring in those 2 guys. So these are initial 53-man rosters. These are by no means the final cuts. We also have a 16-player practice squad that teams are going to be able to fill out after those waiver claims come down when the announcement is made at 1 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday. So right now, you can be happy that you made the initial 53-man roster. Just make sure that you can put a cork back in that champagne tomorrow if things don't go your way in the next 24 hours.
Yeah, this will actually go longer than that, too. I mean, you'll see shuffling amongst the roster active in both practice squad, really up until that week 1 opening day roster. For all those accredited veterans, which means they have to have 5 accredited seasons, there are some veterans that will be brought up and then released before that week 1 opening day roster, because if they are on that roster, their salary is guaranteed for the rest of that season. Otherwise, they can be released and brought back on basically on a week-to-week basis, and they're paid week by week. So, again, this is all more for accounting purposes and trying to work some of those older veteran guys who aren't necessarily stars, but are going to be guys that you may have to rely on or provide depth at some point in time. That's some of the shuffling that goes along as well. So, look, it's a tough process. I mean, I've been sitting in weight rooms where you're kind of working out, training with the guys, and all of a sudden they're coming to grab a guy who thought he was safe, and now he's not. And he may come back on the practice squad, but he would much be rather making that active day or active game check.
So there's not that huge sigh of relief at 4 o'clock like we all just assumed that there is with the deadline.
No, not at all.
There's one guy that, and you mentioned the scenario here, you get released, you get brought back to the practice squad, maybe you go to another team. And that's what happened with Kenyon Drake, released by the Raiders. But the Ravens are in a little bit of dire straits with the running back position again going into this season, at least early on in the season. So they bring Drake on because J.K. Dobbins still a question mark, Pete, and Gus Edwards is out likely at least the first 4 games of the season. So is Drake going to play a role here?
Oh, I don't think there's any question he's going to play a role, and he'll need to play a role. You know, the J.K. Dobbins thing, remember all offseason they said, oh, he'll be ready for camp. He said he was going to be ready for camp. They'll be ready to go by week 1, and it doesn't look that way. So there's concern about the running back position. This makes sense. Look, he's a veteran, can come in, pick up the offense, and be a big part of what they do. He's more than capable of, ripping off long runs. He's more than capable of catching the ball out of the backfield. So it makes sense for the Ravens to bring in a veteran back, at least until those other guys get back on the field.
Pete, one of the most popular segments that we do at CBS Sports HQ is to come up with a winners and losers segment. It always plays well. So we ask you, winners and losers for cut day. I'm not talking about teams. I'm talking about players. Give us at least a couple.
Who was a winner? Anybody who made a team for at least the next 24 hours. I mean, winners and losers. I'll give you 2 guys that I think were cut that will find a job somewhere else, and 2 guys that I really like coming into their careers. Tyler Shelvin, the nose tackle from the Bengals. I thought he would make the team. He's a big physical guy. Kind of hung around for a year, came into camp a little overweight. But for a team looking for a big body that can, help them in the middle, I think he would make some sense. And then Jalen Twyman, when I was at Minnesota last week, and I loved him, in fact, coming out, he was a guy that guys were raving about. They said he had a really good camp. And remember, he missed all of last year because he was shot 4 times. And so he's back on the field. I think a team will give him an opportunity to come in, athletic, up-the-field guy from Pitt, who I think can help somebody. So I think those 2 guys lost today, but I think they'll end up being winners because I think they'll find themselves on a roster somewhere.
Pete Prisco, Jonathan Jones, Brady Quinn, Chris Hassel. That is all for our
wise guy.
Love you, Pete. We love you, Pete.
That is all for our coverage of the deadline to get rosters down to 53, which passed at 4 o'clock Eastern time. We've got the season kickoff a week from Thursday, and football returning to CBS on September the 11th. NFL, National Football League, Week 1 matchups. We got the doubleheader as well. Our draft-a-thon is tomorrow with Jamie Eisenberg and the gang, 6 o'clock Eastern time, benefiting St. Jude.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.